Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Well, feedback. All right. So we've been studying in the prophecy of Malachi the last several weeks. We're going to continue in that study this week. Last week, what we did is we started into the first discourse. So Malachi communicates his prophecies to the people of Israel through these different conversations that they have. And that conversation sort of starts and then he goes into his prophecy. So let's go ahead if we can. Can we read just verses 1 through 5 of Malachi chapter 1?
Malachi chapter 1. The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. For your eyes shall see, and ye shall say, the Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel.
All right, thank you. So like we said, each of these, there's 6 of these, and there are these conversations that lead into a prophecy. And this one opens up with Malachi speaking on behalf of the Lord, telling Israel, I have loved you. Actually, we talked about this is a really powerful way to open up this prophecy, is it opens up with God telling the people, I have loved you. But what's the people's response back to this? Yeah, it's like, how have you loved us? And it's instead of getting this, you almost get like a pushback. And that's, again, this is how the rest of this prophecy is structured, is that these different conversations, and the one we have here really starts off with this question of God trying to tell the people he loves them, and then they push back and say, well, how have you loved us? And so there's a feeling that they are not loved by God. And it really focuses in on Esau and Edom. And we spent some time last week looking at the background of Esau and Edom. Of course, Esau is Edom. Esau was known as Edom, and his descendants became known as the Edomites. And they were near the territory of Israel. They were sort of south and to the east of them. And they had a long history together. And that history started with these 2 brothers as twins in their mother's womb. And, the mother received, Rebecca received this prophecy about them, how the younger, the elder will serve the younger, which is a little bit unusual. And we see in their life, they had a lot of tension between one another. Jacob wanted to get the heritage, he wanted to get the blessings, and, he had some growing to do. He did it in bad ways, right? He had his brother was famished. He refused to give him a bowl of soup. His brother, he tricked his father into thinking that he was his brother, and he received some blessings that way. And as a result of those things, we see that Esau gets so angry at Jacob that he basically says, I'm going to wait till my dad dies, and I'm going to kill him. And that's just how bad things got between these 2 brothers. And that tension, which started between the 2 of them, ends up becoming generational up until this time when Malachi is written, which is, Israel has been a nation for hundreds of years. They've been in exile. Now they've come back. And these 2 groups of people still have tensions between one another that goes back a long time. And last week we looked at, some of the history of the issues that they had. One of the things is when the children of Israel were coming into the promised land, the direct route would have been to go through Edom's territory. And Edom said, no, they refused to let them go through. And so again, some tensions there. And then later on, there are some wars between them. And during the days of King David, David actually goes in and successfully defeats the Edomites, and he puts garrisons in their territory. And from that period, for a long time, the Israelites were actually over the Edomites. They were sort of, I don't know how you want to put it, but they were under the dominion of Israel, and then when Israel, split, they were under the dominion of Judah. And then eventually in days of King Ahaz, they rebelled when he became wicked, but for a long time, that prophecy was really true, is that the elder, which was Edom or Esau, was actually serving Israel, or Jacob, which was the younger. And so then you kind of ask in this, you look in this passage here in Malachi, and the Edomites or Esau, they really are the bad guys, right? It tells us that God is going to destroy them. He's not going to allow them to be rebuilt again. And last week we closed up, we looked at really quickly, and I'd like to just take a minute to look at those, some passages that talk about what is it that Edom did that really draws this ire? What was their sin? And what we're going to see, a lot of what they did was surrounding how they treated Israel when they were under attack by the Babylonians. When I say Israel, I should probably specify Judah at this point. It was the southern kingdom of Judah. But the way that they treated their brethren when they were under the attack of the Babylonians and how they responded. And we'll look at a couple passages. Let's start off by looking at Psalm 137. And Psalm 137, and if we could read verse 7, verse 7, I guess.
Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations.
Thank you. So, Psalm 137, this is a psalm that's given when they're by the rivers of Babylon. And they're sort of mourning the loss of their land. And they're sort of, remembering these horrible things that have happened. And it's not just the Babylonians that the psalmist is writing about. The psalmist is writing about the Edomites, because when they were under attack by the Babylonians, it was Edom that was there on the side, and they were sort of cheering on their destruction. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 35, verse 5. Ezekiel 35, verse 5. And actually, if you could read verses 2 through 5 for context, Ezekiel 35, verses 2 through 5.
Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir and prophesy against it, and say to it, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Mount Seir, and I will stretch out my hand against you, and I will make you a desolation and a waste. I will lay your cities waste, and you shall become a desolation, and you shall know that I am the Lord, because you cherished perpetual enmity and gave over the people of Israel to the power of the sword at the time of their calamity, at the time of their final punishment.
Okay. So it talks about Mount Seir, but Mount Seir is kind of synonymous with Edom in the same way that Mount Zion is synonymous with like Israel or Judah. So Mount Seir here, it's talking about the Edomites. And the Edomites, again, it says that, it talks about you have shed the blood of Israel by the power of the sword at the time of their calamity. So when Israel was down, when they're being attacked by the Babylonians, we get the impression from passages like this that the Edomites were not only cheering that on, but they were actively participating in some of the violence against their brethren. And if you want to flip over to Ezekiel chapter 35, and I think verse 15 as well.
Just 15?
Yeah, just 15 is fine.
Ezekiel 35:15. As thou didst rejoice at the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Idumea, even all of it, and they shall know that I am the Lord.
So again, they're rejoicing over the house of Israel when they're having hard times, and it's like that's going to happen to you. So this gives a little background of why, Edom received such, strong wording when we're in Malachi, is that their background is that when Israel was down, they were sort of joining in. And just one other passage, and it's in Obadiah. So turn over to Obadiah, and it's, of course, Obadiah is just like one chapter. And, the whole prophecy really about Obadiah is about the Edomites. You could really just read the whole book, but we're just going to read a little section, verses 10 through 14. Micah, Nahum, Obadiah. 10 through 14. Verses 10 through 14.
Obadiah was hidden. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. And the day that you stood on the other side, and the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on that day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress.
Okay, thank you. So if you read through those passages in Obadiah, again, all of Obadiah is about Edom and God's condemnation of them. They're really, when Israel was in trouble, when they were being attacked, Edom just sort of jumped in. They're grabbing their spoils. It talks about, there are people who were trying to escape. And the Edomites were grabbing them and killing them. They were taking them back as prisoners. So you really get this idea. They weren't maybe stronger than Israel, when they were both side by side, but once Israel was in trouble, when Judah was in trouble, they were being attacked, the Edomites sort of took advantage of that situation. They took spoil, they attacked those that were weak, that were escaping, things like that. And so this just gives a little context in Malachi why they're condemned so strongly and why God is so thorough about how they're going to be destroyed and they're never going to rise up again. So again, that's just a little background when we're looking at Malachi. Why is Edom called out? Well, that's why, because there's this long enmity, and the recent history around the time of Malachi is that these Edomites have taken advantage of them when they were weak, and they attacked them, they grabbed their spoil, they were cheering on a very treacherous behavior, and so that's why God promises that there's destruction that's going to come for them. And you look back at Malachi, where we were, it does say that they're going to be, their territory is going to be laid waste in verse 3. Verse 4, it says, I will throw down what they try to rebuild, and they'll be cast out forever. And you kind of, just historically, you do kind of see that. With Israel, especially, what happens later on with Judah, or I don't know what you want to call the people who had returned from captivity that were dwelling in the land. I don't know if they went by the name Judah or Israel at that point, but that area that was under the Persian dominion, years later, it's not in the Bible, but we have this in other historical sources, is they eventually come under the dominion of the Greeks. And then the Greeks split up and they fall under the dominion of these Greek generals that set up these kingdoms. You heard the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, right? So it was during the days of the Seleucids. You remember, you've heard the story of Hanukkah, right? Where they were trying to set up these idols in the temple and they did all these things. And this little state here that was under the dominion at the time, they actually rebel and they become kind of a nation again for a while. And they have these kings, and it's during the reign of one of these kings, and we read about. We're getting this source from Josephus, and there are some books we don't have in our Bible, but they're called Maccabees. Everyone heard of those? I'm talking about. But they talk about one of these kings, Judah is his name, and they actually record how he goes in and attacks the land, and he carries out some things. I'll just read. This is from 1 Maccabees 5. It says, Then Judas made war on the descendants of Esau at Acrabatim in Idumea because they were besieging the Israelites. He inflicted on them a massive defeat, overcame them, and took their spoils. And so, this tension doesn't end here in the pages of the Bible. It keeps going on in those areas in between. And eventually the Edomites, and I did some reading, I tried to find out there was this other group known as the Nabateans, and they were kind of Arab groups that were sort of nomads, but they're the ones that eventually kind of move in and push out the Edomites. And if you've ever seen pictures online of that, you ever heard of the city of Petra that's in Jordan that has like all these like rock structures? They're like built into rocks, like these houses. It's in these big, anyway, it's really cool if you look at it. But anyway, they're the people that kind of push out the Edomites. They're known as the Nabateans. So anyway, Edom does get their deserts as time goes on, but this just gives some of the background of why they're called out as the bad guys. As my son said, they were the naughty ones, I think, this morning. That's what the Edomites were at this point. All right, so let's kind of talk about the Edomites. Let's talk about the main message of what's going on here. So God is saying, I have loved you, and then they're questioning this. And this actually gets picked up by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament in Romans 9, this idea of, Jacob I have loved, and then Esau I have hated. There was actually, I remember growing up, I didn't read the book, but I remember seeing this book on library shelves. It was called Jacob I have loved. I remember seeing that book, but I read the synopsis of this, but basically somebody wrote a book titled Jacob I have loved, and the whole idea was about these two sisters, and one sister felt like her parents loved the perfect older sister, and she was sort of this, outcast, and that was where the title comes from, is this idea of God loved Israel, but he hated Edom, and that's how she felt in her relationship. But that's kind of entered the popular vernacular from that. But this is something that Paul picks up on. And let's look over at Romans chapter 9 for a minute. And this is part of a longer conversation that Paul is talking about. But he uses this idea from this passage about the Edomites and Israel, Esau and Jacob. So Romans chapter 9, and we can read verses 10 through 15, kind of picks up on what Paul is talking about.
Romans 9, 10 through 15. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in direction might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion.
Maybe verse 16, I think, kind of finishes that off really nicely.
It does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy.
All right, so, Paul is in this part of a longer conversation, about things about election and promise, and he uses Jacob and Esau as part of this conversation. And when does it say that God makes his decision about who is going to be his chosen one, and and who isn't? When is that decision made? What is Paul's point? Yeah, when they were twins, right? And again, that's what we kind of looked at that last week, and that Sarah received this, or not Sarah, I'm sorry, Rebecca received a prophecy about the two boys that were in there. She felt them struggling within them. And it's like, well, that's actually a forerunner of what's going to happen. But God said, I have chosen Jacob, and he wasn't named Jacob, but the younger is going to be served by the elder. And so Paul puts this into a longer conversation in Romans 9, where he's talking about election and God's purpose, talking about how the Israelites, really very similar to some of the conversations going on in Malachi, they felt like they were been rejected, and Paul is, again, it's a longer conversation about how God was working with Israel and the Gentiles, but this is something that he loops into this conversation. He talks about Jacob and Esau. And it talks about how Jacob was this chosen one, and Esau was not. And again, then it goes on, talks about Pharaoh and so on. But this is, again, this is something that gets pulled into bigger conversations in the New Testament. All right, so, and then let's just go back to Malachi 1 again. So anyway, we looked at how this opens up. God tells Israel, I have loved you. And they said, how have you loved us? So I think a good question to ask, and I'll put this to you, why does Israel challenge this statement? When they're told, I have loved you, why is it that they feel they need to push back on this statement? Why isn't this a reciprocal response? Why is it, how have you loved us?
I think it's because they don't, they don't see themselves as being treated any differently from any of the other nations. They would picture, oh, well, if you loved us, then we would live under this dome of glass and be perfect like Eden. So you must not love us.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that they're looking at what's happened to them, and they're struggling with it, right? Because there's different ways you can interpret this, right? Again, the background is they've just come out of exile, so they've gone through this massive destruction. Their temple was destroyed, and again, this is an important concept, is understanding how you perceive things around you. There's two ways you can look at that. One is that we're not loved. We've been sent out to exile because God doesn't love us. But what does the Bible tell us what was really happening in that whole scheme of things? Yeah.
At that point, as children, we discipline our children, and I'm sure there are times where thought may cross their mind that, this is not pleasant, they must not like me. But as parents, we're trying to teach them something, and God was doing the same thing. We don't learn from times of comfort. We learn from, the things that we do wrong, and it's brought to our attention, and sometimes that's not pleasant, but that's how we learn, and that's what God was doing with Israel. So it sounds terrible to say, but maybe a spoiled child, maybe?
Keep in mind, the temple was destroyed 70 plus years earlier. So you got probably a couple of generations of people, of the grandchildren of those who were originally sent into exile, who may not understand the history as well. I don't know. We don't know how much they communicated, and sometimes history can be forgotten and not understood, and then they're dealing with problems, and they've yet to connect the dots of how they got there. I'm just suggesting, because we all think of the exiles, we might subconsciously think they were the ones that were exiled, but these are like the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who were originally exiled. And the history has to be learned of how we got here, and how they've been indoctrinated by idol worship and things like that, and trying to steer them back. It would be hard to turn generations around who didn't live through it. I'm just imagining if it was me, what my great-grandparents did, how does that affect me? So, anyway.
So we see the answer when they ask him, how do you love me? And his answer is how you know he loves them, whether they can see it or not. He says, you got two brothers, two nations. You got Esau and Jacob. One of them I detested because I knew what he would be, and one I said I loved. And if you look at the history too, even where they're at, even though they went through exile, the one whom God still supports and is still behind is Israel, Jacob's children, and all these things here. And so he has laid waste to the mountains of Esau. All that they have has been destroyed. Even though Israel was punished, they have been returned to what he has given to them. So proof is right before their eyes if they'll just but see it.
Yeah, and I think that, in this book too, it comes up again in a couple other places. This idea of, chapter 2, verse 17, one of the things they have to address is this attitude of all who do evil, God is pleased with. And then chapter 3, verse 14, it says it's futile to serve God. These are some attitudes that the people had, and part of it is probably what's happened to them is their experience in the exile. They're perceiving this rather than correction to bring them back to God, they're seeing this as being rejection. And, you just have to be careful of how you perceive things because it can be wrong, right? Have you ever heard of the concept of prosperity theology? Does anybody? Yeah, so there's this idea out there, and it's really exploited by, people who want to make money, right? What do they tell people? If you want to be rich, do what? Send me money, send me $100 and God will bless you with 1,000, right? But this is the idea that somehow, they equate someone who's wealthy, who's prosperous, and who's doing well with righteousness. And on the other hand, someone who's maybe struggling and has bad things happen with evil. Yeah.
Along that line of thought, you look at the scribes and Pharisees by the time of Jesus. They actually had bought into this mentality. The whole nation of Israel had bought into that prosperity mentality because when Jesus says it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than a camel through the eye of a needle, right? The disciples were blown away because they were like, "What? But these rich men must be righteous. They must be the most righteous people because they've been so rich, right?" And so you had this idea of prosperity gospel starting to affect them from maybe even the time of Malachi, and by the time we see it in Jesus' time frame, it has reached the full fruition of where even the general folk would are thinking that this is the way it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to build on that, in the Hebrew back in Malachi, that word for I hated Esau, that word for hated in Hebrew is to detest, to treat as an enemy. I mean, pretty harsh words for him. Yet when Paul quotes it in the New Testament, he uses the Greek word misos, which actually carries with the idea, I just loved him less, which gives us a hint that even though God detested who and what they are, he still had love for everyone. And I think that's what he's trying to convey to his people here.
I think Jan maybe had a... Oh, sorry.
So I think it's a good lesson for us when we, I think sometimes we can say, I'm so blessed, and, other people who aren't blessed at that. I think anyone, including Israel, can isolate a moment in their history when they're in a period of blessing, right? And then other times when they're in a period of being chastened, right? And so all of us, as we walk, or have those same periods in our lives, right? So, when you say you're really blessed, other people that aren't in that situation were like, oh, good for you. Do you think you're righteous because you're being blessed right now? And so it creates that stigma of, oh, you must be doing something right and I'm not, because look at my life versus yours. But everyone, I think anyone walking with Christ and trying to walk towards salvation is going to have those moments of blessing and moments of being chastened. So I think it's a good, the example of Israel, that as much as they can look at how bad things have been, they can also look at how God delivered them from Egypt and how they were able to walk into the land and defeat unsurmountable enemies and things like that. So
I was just going to add to what Walter said, is that, Rachel and Leah, it said Leah was hated. Well, we don't think for 1 minute that God hated her and despised her. But that phrase, loved less, was her unfortunate that was laid upon her, which was very, very difficult for any woman, to be loved less. Doesn't mean you're not loved. And that's in a whole emotional roller coaster ride that can be on a national level also. Just throw that out there.
And I think you started alluding to it for verses 4 and 5 as you were reading them and alluding to them. In 4, we see the example of what God is trying to establish for Israel to see. Edom is the example of what will happen to those who stand against me willfully. Because Edom has said, I'm going to come back and rebuild. I don't care what God said. And God said, yeah, try that and see what happens to you. And then you find out in 5, as you were alluding to, that the whole point is so that God is glorified. Not Israel, it's God who has to be glorified. So this struggle between these two is for the glory of God.
Our struggle is to keep the mentality that Habakkuk defines, and that is, although the fig tree shall not blossom, fruit's not on the vine, labor the olive fails, fields yield no meat, everything's cut off, what do you still do? You still rejoice in the Lord, whether there are good things that are happening to you and God is blessing you, or whether there are trials that are happening and God is testing you, right? Your job is always to rejoice in no matter what side of the fence you're on there.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, because it's not always as simple as looking at something and saying, well, they're doing good, they're suffering, they're bad. The Bible, it's much more complicated, because there's people that did good and prospered. Think of Solomon, and maybe Abraham had a lot of wealth. When you think about the Lord Jesus himself and all the suffering he endured, the godliest man, so you have to be careful about how you view those things. And the children of Israel, you see here, they're really struggling with that. They've been through a lot, and so they're really questioning, okay, does God really love us? And so this is part of what this book is leading into that. And because of that thinking, it actually leads them into disobedience. And that's where the rest of this book goes, is all the bad things they start doing is they question God's love, they question his plan for them, and then it leads to other actions that draw them away from the Lord, and they start making some really bad decisions that need to be addressed. I did want to read, Casey, yeah.
I just wanted to point out, though, that it is easy to make that sort of prosperity theology connection, because when they were in the wilderness, they had the opportunity to go into the land within 2 years. And they blew it, and we know what happened over the next 38 years. Over the course of their history, it was they would fail, they would be punished, they would come back to God and prosper, and then they would fail and be punished, and they would come back to God and prosper. So, there is an apparent connection between worshiping God appropriately, correctly, and prosperity. It's just not a perfect connection.
And so what is that prosperity, though? Is it a state of mind as much as it is physical blessing, right? So, we can return to a state of prosperity when we're walking in line with what God wants us to do, right? And so you can actually prosper that way in terms of spiritual well-being, right? And you don't worry as much about your material status in life if you're walking more closely with God, right? So it can be more than just what prosperity theology teaches is like material prosperity, right? And so I think prosperity can be measured in a spiritual manner as well.
So if you look at the conclusion, I guess, of this little dialogue here, it ends in verse 5, and it says, your eyes shall see, and then it says, you shall say, the Lord is magnified beyond the border of Israel. And I think this is sort of the end conclusion of this relationship between God and Israel. I think someone else said that it was for God's glory. I forget who mentioned that, but that's kind of the end of this, is that God's going to use this, not just for you, but he's going to glorify his name beyond Israel. And this, again, this is something we see in other places in the Bible. One we quote a lot, we can look at Numbers chapter 14, picks up on a very similar item. Numbers 14, verse 21.
But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord.
And so this is talking about Israel during the days of the exile and the things that are going on then. But again, this is an idea. God is using this for a long-term purpose to fill the earth with his glory. And they were part of that. And there's just that reminder and all these events that are taking place, whether they're going into exile, they're being attacked, but there's a long-term plan that God has, and he's trying to get them to be part of that, to be part of that time when God fills the earth with his glory. He's going to bring his people with him during that time. Probably another good one to look at is Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5.
And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel. Yea, ye shall flee, like as you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. And the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with thee.
I'm sorry, it's 5 through 9, I meant to say.
5 through 9.
Through verse 9, yeah.
And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear, nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night. But it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and in winter it shall be. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one.
All right, thank you. So it's picked up on again in Zechariah that there's a longer term vision with all that's going on. The things with Israel and their neighbors, this isn't just some squabbling between some regional groups of people fighting over land. There's a bigger picture behind all that's taking place. I think, you see in Malachi and some of the other prophets, this is something that God is trying to help them remember, is that this is bigger than them. This is God's long-term goal, is to fill the earth with his glory, is to be king over all the earth. And his reminder, in these various prophecies is, you look past the present and try to be part of that bigger future, I guess, if you want to put it that way. What is our finish time? Actually, I don't even. Is it 25 after? Okay.
I think it might be in Deuteronomy, I can't remember offhand, and I haven't looked it up, is, God says on a couple of occasions that you are my witnesses, to the people of Israel. So, that's obviously shows the bigger purpose of what they're serving.
Just a thought on the apparent prosperity that was going on with the Jews during the time when if they sinned, then they would be punished. If they were to change, they were then to be given apparent prosperity. That was because of God clearly saying, follow after me, and I'm going to bless you as a nation. I'm going to take care of you. If you don't follow me, I'm going to punish you. And it didn't mean that individual people's lives didn't have periods of lows and highs like we do, but at least on a whole, the nation was doing well, and it was a sign of God's protection of this nation that they were going to be doing well. They were able to beat surmountable odds, and that was, I think, the biggest difference between the nation of Israel compared to us when we look at how we may have blessings or trials that go in our lives that make it so that we actually learn to cleave to God more than rather if we look at it in the right way.
Isaiah. I just want to close. I'll look at Psalm 37. I think this kind of picks up again on this whole idea where, this passage here is talking about Israel. They're looking at what's happening. They're really questioning God working in their lives. But Psalm 37 is really a good psalm that kind of addresses this idea of you just have to be careful what you're seeing around you and what conclusions you draw, I guess. And if we could read, there's 11 verses that I'd like to read out of Psalm 37, verses 1 through 11. Someone could read that for us.
Do not fret because of evildoers. Be not envious toward wrongdoers, for they will wither quickly like the grass and fade like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he will do it.
He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord, wait patiently for him. Fret not yourselves over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger, forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it lends only to evil. But the evildoer shall be cut off, and those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace.
Right. Thank you for reading that. So I think that ties in with what is going on in Malachi with the Israelites, is that's exactly what they're doing. They're fretting themselves. I think they've come back into the land, and there's some of these people around them that are more established than they are. You kind of get that idea as they first come back. You've got, maybe the Edomites are and some of these other nations that are really giving them a hard time. And it seems like it's getting in their head. Like they're really questioning whether God is with them. And this is the passage of Psalm, and Psalmist says, don't fret over evildoers. Don't let that they're eventually, maybe they're here today, but they're going to wither like the grass. And it says, trust in the Lord. And it says, eventually, maybe it's the evil and the wicked that are prospering now, but eventually it says the meek shall inherit the earth. The people that trust in God are going to outlast those that don't. And so this is the reminder I think the people in Malachi's day needed to hear to get their hearts in the right place. So God willing, I believe I'm still on. Joe said something about 2 weeks. I'm not sure if I'm doing this to conclusion, but if I'm on still, next week in Malachi, we will continue into starting in verse 6, and it's kind of a longer discussion that goes to chapter 2, verse 9, but it touches on the priests and the worship and the things that are going on at that time. You'll see that's one of the big issues that's leading the people away, is the way they were conducting their worship. Now that they're back from the exile, they've got the temple again, but they're going back into their old habits. They're starting to do things that are they're wrong, the way that they're, so anyway, we'll get into that, but God willing, that's where we're hoping to go next week when we pick up again, if that's the plan. So, thank you.